once for yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. Hello, lovely listeners. We're back, and it feels like we skipped spring in England this year and launched straight from the chilly fireside days of winter into blazing summer. I'm sure many of you will have taken advantage of the warm days and many bank holidays of May to take part in that favourite British pastime of taking a trip to the seaside. But if you haven't had the opportunity, maybe we can bring you a breath of vicarious sea air in this episode's paranormal postcard, with lashings of ghost stories, of course. So Fitz, what's coming up on today's episode?
We have a new sighting of the ghost of Barford Bridge caught on camera. We have listener stories from Sara, Rowan and Kate, and we're following the footsteps, or perhaps rope burns, of fearless abseiling archaeologists by visiting what's left of Dunwich, Britain's Atlantis, before what remains is devoured by the North Sea.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say welcome and a huge thank you to our latest patrons.
Alex Gretton West,
Nance Rhodes,
Sophie Hollinshead,
Rebecca Davis,
Ashley Russell,
Jenny Miller,
Lady Laird,
Tracy Stewart,
and Tad Stones, who we also need to wish a very
happy birthday, Tad! Now, in our family, we don't actually sing Happy Birthday. We sing the theme tune to Jurassic Park. I'm sure this has come up before. We don't really want to invoke any copyright laws, but just imagine in your head the theatrical booming of the Jurassic Park, the orchestral Jurassic Park theme tune, wishing you a happy, happy birthday.
And we'd also like to thank Elizabeth Schmidt, JC and Darkwing's dad for making donations through coffee.
We had some really, really lovely messages via coffee, and we're so sorry that we only just saw these and were delayed responding to you all. For some reason, our notifications weren't actually notifying us of anything. I don't know why. It's obviously just one of those gremlins in the machine. But thank you all so much for your kind words. They were really, really lovely. And thank you so much to all of our patrons and supporters, old and new. We're constantly blown away, not only that we're able to continue with the show because of your support, but also just by the incredibly kind messages of support and encouragement we receive from you all. We've said it before and we'll say it again. We just don't know how we got so lucky, but we really do have the best podcast community in the world.
We really do.
And with all that said, Fitz, what has pinged the Paranormal Radar today?
Well, the Paranormal Radar this episode pinged very close to home, as a driver believes they spotted the ghost of Barford Bridge and even captured it on their dash cam. I believe we first shared the story in one of our Hello Birthday Ween specials, where firms seem to compete to produce the most tenuous paranormal-related story relating to their business during the spooky season, and that year it happened to be a car insurance company sharing the most haunted roads in Britain. It jumped right off the page at me somewhat, as it's a road I know well. I've driven it hundreds of times, and it's only about 20 minutes away from us. I must say, though, that even though I've driven it so frequently, I've never personally seen the ghost, or ghosts to be more particular, that are said to haunt it. The newspaper article references one of the lesser-known accounts, that of the ghost of a bride who died on the way to her wedding, but that certainly isn't the most famous ghost. And in fact, I'm struggling to find much of a reference to the ghost of a bride at the location at all. The ghost most commonly attributed to the sightings is that of a monk, said in some sources to be from the nearby Pipewell Abbey, which is only about 1.5 miles away as the crow flies. In others, the monk belonged to a chapel in the village of Barford that's no longer in existence. Wherever he was from, he was frequently sighted drifting across the road near the bridge. Sometimes the sighting was even clear enough that witnesses reported that it appeared as if he was carrying something. Perhaps even more strangely, he was also encountered sitting on the back seat of people's cars in the vicinity of the bridge, shocking those who checked their rearview mirror to find a bearded face staring back at them. One of those reporting a spooky hitchhiker was even a police sergeant. He reported seeing the face of the bearded monk in the rear of his car in 1984. In fact, it seems odd that the ghost is even paired with the bridge, as it seems the vast majority of the sightings happen not at the bridge, but on the close-by Newton Road. Our friend Ruth Roper Wild has collected quite a few accounts of paranormal encounters at or around Barford Bridge in her fantastic roadmap of British ghosts, available now for anyone who quite rightly wants to add it to their spooky library, and for which I'll place a link in the show notes. These encounters even contain not a ghost, but a cryptid. Again, on Newton Road, a couple, recently moved to the area, were on their way to a friend's party when a creature stepped out of the hedge and into the beam of their car's headlights. The creature was around 8 feet tall, with strangely elongated arms and legs, naked and hairless, and with an elongated face. It turned robotically to look at the pair inside the car, before loping across the road into the cover of the hedge on the other side. Aside from it being a naked 8-foot-tall humanoid rather than a monk, the story is eerily similar to the video that sparked this whole radar story. Reported in the Northamptonshire Telegraph, a man was driving down Newton Road one night when he saw the figure of a monk stood in the hedgerow at the side of the road. This might just have been an interesting anecdote, except for the fact that he happened to have a dash cam that caught the encounter. It shows the view through the windscreen of the vehicle as it takes the roundabout near Barford Bridge, turns onto Newton Road, and passes another car. Just after the other car passes, a figure in a brown cloak can be seen at the side of the road, and looking closely, there are some other details that might just be a wooden crucifix and a rope belt. It's surprisingly clear, but before we made any further conclusions, we knew that we had to go and visit for ourselves. We decided that it was probably best if we went in daylight so we could get a better look at the area to see if there was anything that might be mistaken for the figure of a monk, and because our cameras are pretty naff at shooting at night. We duly hopped into the coffinmobile and went to take a look. We pottered up and down the Newton Road a few times, paying particular attention to the area in the video that the ghost was spotted, but we failed to see anything that might have appeared at night to be the figure of a monk. I must admit that I was half expecting there to be some waste fabric caught on a tree branch or something, but it was completely free of any such items. And so, after investigating ourselves, we can only confirm a hearty, I don't know. We did take a bit of video of our visit, which in true coffee fashion didn't go entirely according to plan, and patrons should look out for that shortly so you can take a look for yourselves. But the article and the original witnesses video will be linked on the show notes on the website.
We may not have seen the ghost, but we did definitely see some surprising wildlife.
Indeed.
It made us jump a bit.
Some of it rather very unexpected,
Very
jumping out of the hedgerows at us.
Yeah, I would recommend everybody go and have a look at the video if you're interested. It is a remarkably clear capture.
Yep.
If there's nothing untoward going on. Untoward, that's not the right word, is it?
Yeah.
If it's not fake, is basically what I'm saying.
See, this is the problem. Like, we're never ever going to really be able to say anything other than...
We don't know because we weren't there. No.
Yeah.
This is the problem. It's an amazing capture. It could be the most amazing capture ever that we've ever seen. It could be the capture that confirms this long-standing myth and legend. But the problem is most people are probably going to look at it and think it's been faked because it is so clear.
Yeah.
And there is, as we've talked about before, the paradox of paranormal evidence. If it's too good, nobody will believe it, unfortunately. So all we can ever say is, well, we don't know. We have to take it on the word of the person who's submitting it and presenting it as real, because we weren't there.
Indeed, but nevertheless, a very, very interesting video, and you can catch our deluded ramblings if you're a patron coming very soon.
And our slightly disastrous couple of trips as we tried to investigate.
Yes, disaster of disaster. Starbucks didn't have any cold brew.
That was the biggest disaster.
It was.
I know. How very dare.
Shocking.
But now it's time to move on to the listener stories of the episode. And for this first one, we get to take a little break as Kate very kindly reads her story to us all.
Hi Fitz, hi Lil, hi everyone. Hope you're all well. I'm recording a story today to share with you all that happened to me and a best friend of mine when we were teenagers. My parents, oldest and best friends, lived in a very, very old house in a rural village in Essex. The oldest part of the house was built in 1665. So it was terribly old and complete with the duck pond and a large garden and out buildings, barns. It was really the quintessential English country home. It looked old and it felt old and I loved it. We were lucky enough to spend a lot of our childhood here and it was my happy place of wonder and adventure. For a child like myself with a huge imagination, it was a dream come true to be able to run around a house like this. And then when we were a little bit older, to learn that it had its own resident ghost. Every time we visited, and as far back as I can remember, I asked our family friends about the ghost who lived at their home, and I was fascinated with the stories, even when I heard the same ones over and over again. I guess I never tired of them, probably because, well, I knew they were true, because I had by then experienced quite a few things myself. For one, the house had a great deal of activity in terms of things going missing and turning up again in a different place to where they had been originally left. Footsteps were often heard walking on the wooden floorboards upstairs on the landing, going from one side of the house to the other. And where the footsteps stopped was in the far bedroom where the eldest daughter, our family friend, experienced quite horrible nightmares. Obviously in the night time, to the point she moved bedrooms. At one stage, they turned their home into a B&B. One of the rooms was occupied by a male that weekend who came down in the morning and had asked who was knocking on the bedroom door. But he soon realised, as did our family friend, that there wasn't anyone there because she was outside in the garden gardening. Another time, our family friend went into the bedroom, not the one with the nightmares, the other one by the top of the stairs, where the footsteps would always first start, and there was a perfect dent on the duvet, as if a person had been sitting there. So I grew up with all these stories about the home. My grandma, Alice, even encountered whoever it was upstairs on a visit to our friends one weekend. She was walking along the corridor upstairs when a picture literally jumped off the wall and landed in front of her. I remember her telling me that the cord on the back remained intact when she turned it over. Whilst these accounts fascinated me, as I've said, they were not my stories. I yearned to have my own story about the house, as I felt so connected to it growing up. And little did I know that this would come true. I was about 14, in the middle of my GCSEs, or maybe a bit older, 15, 16, when we went to stay at the farm for the weekend, and I was thrilled that my best friend was coming with us too. On this particular day, it was a Saturday, we were sat at the kitchen table giggling away at each other, as we always did and still do. We're still very good friends. When we both stopped and heard footsteps walking above us on the landing upstairs overhead. And as predicted, like the stories we've been told, they went from the far end by the top of the stairs all the way down the corridor to the back bedroom, which was directly above us. We idly kind of carried on chatting until we kind of looked at each other, at one another, and realised that was all a bit odd, because it dawned on us that we were the only ones in the house. And then as we looked out of the kitchen window, to see my parents, sister and brother all playing cricket in the garden. So that was our experience. I got the feeling the spirit was male, the footsteps were loud, really loud and very heavy and with purpose. And I just feel quite thrilled that I finally had my own encounter at the house of such great wonder and excitement as a young child was able to explore it. And yes, that's my story for today. I have shared one before. That was about a spirit I saw in my 20s at work one day whilst making tea. I have many, 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 many others. Ironically, as I was thinking about which story to send in this week, something happened at my flat this one afternoon, which was a bit strange. So maybe I'll share that one another time. But I hope you enjoyed listening, and thank you, Fitz and Lil and everyone, for this amazing platform where we can have an open forum of showing these amazing things that happen to us. I feel very privileged. Lots of love. Have a great day.
And thank you to Kate for sharing that story, and for the tea story, which was awesome as well.
Yeah, I'll never forget that one. That was amazing. And thank you so much for reading it as well. It's lovely to get a story read to us occasionally, and you did it so well. It was so well told, really evocative, and I really felt the kind of magic and mystery of that amazing place. It sounds incredible. I'd love to have somewhere like that now in our lives, that we can go and experience that magic and all the stories and history tumbling around in an incredible place like that. It must have been so special for you to have then had your own experience to put into that melting pot.
And we're also super excited to hear your other stories.
Yeah, bearing in mind how incredible the last two have been, we can't wait to see what else you've got to share with us. Thank you so much for that, and we really hope you send us some more in, please. But for now, we have another incredible story, and this one is from Rowan.
Back in 2017, I went on a ghost walk around a rather haunted castle in the Midlands. It was an interesting experience, with the night involving a séance in the dungeon, table tipping, the chance to try automatic writing, and a spirit board that looked more like a cake stand than a typical Ouija board. I think that form of spirit board is supposed to give the spirits less control, as they can't make shapes with a planchette. They can only spin the board to the letter they wish to convey. One of the spirits I communicated with through the board was a girl of about 6 years old called Ella. I'd felt something brush against my hand earlier in the night, when there was nothing close enough to me to explain it away, and I'd been told by one of the guides that it could be little Ella. Unfortunately, I can't remember the story of how she died, but I'm fairly sure she, or something else from that evening, followed me home. After that night, unsettling things began happening at my flat. Doors would open or close by themselves, and granted that could be changing air pressure, but it had never happened before. I also heard my guitar strings being plucked whilst I was home alone, and in a different room. The most chilling thing that happened was while I was home alone in the bath. I heard the front door open, and footsteps entered and stopped outside the bathroom door. I called out to who I thought was my flatmate coming back unexpectedly early from work. Dread flooded through me at the silence in response. I texted my housemate and the few friends who had keys, but none had stopped by. It was petrifying to be in such a vulnerable position, naked and afraid, with what I thought was an intruder on the outside of my bathroom door. Eventually, a friend I'd contacted who lived nearby came to scope out the flat, as I was too afraid to leave. And of course, there was no one outside the bathroom. The flat had been devoid of human life besides myself. Whatever spirit followed me from the castle, I believe they were giving me signs to get out. And they were right to, because the individual I was living with was not a good person. A few months later, I was able to leave and return to my family home, which came with its own challenges and paranormal activity, but was ultimately what I needed to keep safe. I'm always grateful to Ella, or whoever followed me from the castle that night, because they set off those initial alerts that caused me to feel uncomfortable living with that person in that space. As a little aside, I've always had a little more authority with the spirits at my parents' house. There have been times when I've heard pots and pans rattling in the kitchen while I've been home alone, or felt a presence in the room with me and been able to tell them I'm not comfortable and they need to leave me alone. Thankfully, they always listen. But there was one occasion that the spirit didn't hang around long enough for me to ask her to stay. Back in 2019, my brother rescued a street dog called Nessie. She was only a few months old and had had a terrible start to life living on the streets. But what we didn't know when we adopted her was that she was actually very unwell. After only a month of living with us, she died due to complications of lungworm. The last time I saw Nessie, she was lying on our sofa, where I gave her a kiss before my mum took her to the vets. I truly thought that she'd get some tablets and come straight back home, but sadly she was too poorly and was unfortunately put to sleep. Several days later, I was home alone again, lying on the sofa where Nessie had last been, with my eyes closed listening to a paranormal podcast called And That's Why We Drink. A sudden noise of rubber bouncing and a light jingle of a bell caused me to open my eyes. What I saw was a dog's ball rolling across the living room floor. Our other dog was in the kitchen, and there was nothing else that could have set the ball rolling. I truly believe it was Nessie giving me a little sign she was okay now, as she'd never been able to play during her time in our world.
Thank you so much, Rowan, for sharing your experiences with us. I'm so sorry about Nessie. That's really, really sad. But on the other hand, I'm really grateful that she at least got that little opportunity to find a loving home with you at the end of her life and have somewhere to come back to. At least she found a safe place and you were able to give her that right at the end. But it's still, it's heartbreaking. You know, we're animal people and we had to get the Kleenex out, obviously. And for the other part of your story, well, firstly, I want to see this cake stand Ouija board.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated now. Absolutely fascinated. I'm going to have to go away and look this up because I really want to know how that works and have a go with one. It sounds amazing. But also, I love the fact that we speak a lot about how ghosts aren't necessarily always as scary as they might seem. And that, of course, when you're in a situation as you were, with these footsteps coming up the stairs and just ending and then followed by silence when you're vulnerable in the bathroom, of course that is absolutely terrifying, and we've had similar experiences ourselves. But then we've been in a similar position here in this house, actually, where initially when we had activities start to happen, we were very disturbed and distressed by it. Didn't know what it was. It was very scary. But then we came to understand later that actually whoever was haunting this house really had our best interests in mind, to the point where they potentially saved us from a very scary fire in our living room. And I feel like this is kind of what you've taken away from what's happened to you, is that this spirit is actually helped you out and was there for your protection, which is amazing. And I'm so grateful to the spirit for getting you out of a bad situation.
And it always seems weird and spooky when it happens to you, but if the only way you've got to communicate is to make like stompy noises and that sort of thing, it's really difficult to to try and communicate. We've even attempted to do it here, and it's difficult when you're intending to, let alone when something that all it can do is stomp about the place is trying to warn you of something.
Yeah, but how amazing, how wonderful that you went to that place and you did that investigation, and for whatever reason that enabled you to for those warnings to come through to you to get out of that situation and get yourself to safety in a better position. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that experience, those experiences with us. And we have one more story on the schedule for you today.
We do indeed. And this one is from Sara.
When I was 13, my mother decided we'd move across town to a suburb directly on the sea outside Stockholm, Sweden. I strongly remember seeing the house for the first time. It came into view when we drove down a small hill from the main road. A large, squarish yellow house materialised against the dark sea backdrop. It was a brick building with few windows on the sides of it, but the windows that overlooked the sea were huge. When we came into the house, it was dark and cold. I remember being confused as to why I couldn't see almost anything, even though it was midday. Large rooms with 4-metre ceilings that could be described as halls passed me by as I went further into the house. The previous owner emptied the house, yet it felt that it was somehow alive, as if crowds of people were following me in my footsteps, although I couldn't pinpoint why I felt that way. The wooden floors creaked with every step I took, and somehow, deep within myself, I remember that I formulated a thought: it will hear me at all times. Further into the building, a long and wide wooden staircase led up from another hall to the second-floor landing, where my bedroom entrance was situated just opposite the end of the stairs. A dark, oppressive feeling came over me. I don't want this room, I remember thinking. Then I must be on my watch all the time so it cannot come up the stairs. However scary the first visit to the house had been, my family and I settled in. I was enrolled in a school in the city, more than 1.5 hours away from the house, so I usually woke up early and came home late. During these years, I mostly remember my time alone in the place. Since we had no cell phones at that time, I never knew if I'd come home to a large family dinner or if I'd come home to an empty house. I always wished for the first option, but that seldom happened. My mum had put a lot of effort into making the house cosier after we'd moved in. She'd repainted all the rooms and even decorated the piano room where I did my piano lessons with a mural depicting a forest landscape. The beautiful, enormous kitchen overlooking the ocean with its large Art Deco-style windows had been totally redone, ready to host large parties. I remember my bedroom walls were covered by wallpapers from Laura Ashley, and I even got pink carpeting on my floor. But even so, the house roared with dark shadows. The general feeling of being watched or chased became normal for me. If I was there alone, I got used to running to each room, even during the daytime. When I arrived at the house, if it was empty, I walked quickly to the left into a small corridor that was always dark, where shadows tended to sit on the walls above me, hovering like bats. After that little nightmarish passage, then came the middle hall. Strategically, I would run straight into the kitchen so I wouldn't have to glance up towards the staircase where something could materialise. My safe haven was the couch overlooking the living room where the television was. When settling there, my breath was restored. I would eat junk food while watching Love Boat for hours while the house got darker and darker. When the show was off, so was my entertainment for the evening, and I had to go to bed. That was the usual time when my stomach would turn, because I knew what I had to do. I'd have to run through all of the rooms downstairs to switch off the ceiling lights, while it felt like I was being chased by a slender grey figure without any clothes. At times I had to pause to rest in a neutral place such as the bathroom downstairs, but even inside such a place I was afraid of what was waiting for me on the outside. The bathroom was the last room I had to flee into before running up the stairs, away from the dark hallway below, quickly skidding into my bedroom, closing the door and locking it. My mum always wondered why I had put a lock on my door, but I always explained that I wanted to be alone, which was a lie. I didn't want to isolate myself from my family, but I needed to know how to keep it, or them, out of my room. That was the only place I felt genuinely safe, with my Laura Ashley wallpapers, my journals, my cassette player blasting out Blur, and all my books. Until that night, that is. I remember that it was storming heavily when I walked home from the train station, and when it was terrible weather close to the sea, the wind roared. I tried to walk with the wind beating on me from the sea and slapping my scarf around my face. Once inside the dark, empty house, I went the standard running rounds, turning all the lights on. There was no option, because if I ever tried to slow down inside the house, it felt as if someone tried to choke me, push me up against a wall, or just tried to diminish me with its unseen presence. I took some food from the kitchen, gathered my backpack, and went into the piano room to practice my piano homework. It might sound cliché, but it was a minor piece that scared me when I started playing. But I knew I had to do the work since I had a performance at my piano school. The room was dark, except for my small lamp above the piano and the electric chandelier in the centre that hung over a large rectangular dining table. Every time I practiced, independent of the day or nighttime, I felt like I was being watched by a man in a dark suit. On this night, the feeling loomed over me as I continued playing, but I was too afraid to turn my head around and stare him in the face, so I continued playing. All of a sudden, I felt two large hands pressing down on my shoulders. It was a controlling touch and not a comforting one. I stopped playing, horrified, and just as I stopped, the hands slowly lifted from my shoulders. The thing was in the room, and if I turned my head, I would see what it was. But instead of doing that, terrified of what consequences that would bring, I continued playing until I couldn't play any more. By that time, I was exhausted by fear and hunger and decided not to turn any lights off before I went upstairs to my room. Instead, I ran out to the kitchen, grabbed some bananas from the fruit bowl and ran upstairs, leaving the house bright as a lighthouse. When I was running upstairs, it felt as though I was running in slow motion. "He's coming after you," a voice in my head kept calling me. I slammed the door behind me, razzled with the lock and got the door secured. I felt safe. I put on the tape recorder and music from Suede's debut album started playing, not loud, and it felt comforting. I had 3 small windows in my bedroom, all located in a single file opposite the door, and the rain and wind kept pounding on the window panes. Writing a little journal about stuff that had happened at school would be an excellent way to end the horrible evening, so I sat by my desk and began writing. I wrote about the boy I liked at the time, Johan, and how cute he was when he showed his dimples when he smiled, and maybe I wrote he thinks of me in the same way. I was deep in my thoughts about the disco planned to be held the weekend after in my school's cafeteria, when I heard a sound coming from the door. At first I wasn't afraid, but then I turned round and looked at the door. The door handle was moving slowly up and down, up and down. I screamed and looked out the windows. The only way to get out of the house was through the window into the storm. "Get away!" I screamed in terror, jumped on the bed and opened the window, the wind tearing down the posters on the opposite wall while I did so. I stood on top of my bed and watched the door handle for at least 30 minutes, while the wind kept whirling things around in my room. It didn't move again. This is just one story from the house I lived in for 5 years. Years after we'd moved away, I asked Mum if she knew anything about the family who had lived there before us. I recalled that she happily confessed that the son in the family now went to the same university as my sister, and that he'd become the sweetest boy. "Having said that, though," she continued, "I never thought he would make it. He had a terrible father, you know. He was very mean to his children, apparently. It was a sad story, as I've heard. Come to think of it, that father died in the house."
And thank you to Sara for sharing that story. It brought home so much of what happened to us at our old house in Abington, being chased through the house. I know exactly exactly how you feel.
Although, to be fair, we don't really, because most of the time in that house, we weren't alone, were we? I can only imagine how much more I mean, it was terrifying enough as it is. It really kind of brought back those memories of racing up the stairs and like running from room to room basically almost with your hands over your eyes, just feeling that physical feeling of somebody just bounding up the stairs after you. It was awful. But I don't remember very often actually being alone in that house. Because it was a shared house, there was usually other people. And that only helped so much. So to have been on your own at such a young age with all that going on, I can't imagine how terrifying. I just can't. I'm so sorry that you went through that. And unfortunately, that sort of that begs quite a sharp contrast to the last story we were talking about, where, you know, some ghosts can be really helpful and just want the best for you and really be there to, you know, try and keep you safe. And then there are other ghosts like this, where it's far more sinister, far more scary. But I think what we always try and, the context that we always try and put it in for people is that ghosts are like people. And some people are lovely and they want the best for you and they're only there to help, and their behaviour might seem a bit disconcerting because we don't understand it, but, you know, they're really only trying to help. And then other people are horrible people. And, you know, if they're horrible in life, they may well be horrible in the afterlife. And what a sad story. But thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, you mentioned that you may have had other experiences in the house. If you had, I'd be very interested to hear them, of course.
We are always fascinated by anything that anybody's experienced.
Well, that is the end of the listener stories for today's episode. Thank you so much to everyone who shared their story with us today. We are truly, honestly, we're honoured each and every time you trust us to tell your stories. And they are the foundation of why we began this weird and wonderful endeavour in the first place. So if you have a story you'd like to share, please do get in touch on our website at notonceVS.com.
But don't worry, we've got plenty more spookiness for you today. So grab a cup of tea and a biscuit, or maybe get into the seaside spirit with an ice lolly and settle in as we take you on a paranormal postcard in search of Britain's Atlantis.
This paranormal postcard trip was a little bit different. Usually we visit towns in search of their ghosts, but this time we were heading off to explore the ghost of a town. Dunwich is a place most often referred to by what it has lost rather than what it has. The lost city of Dunwich, the sunken city, Britain's Atlantis, all very big, dramatic names for a tiny village with a population of just 84 at the 2001 census. But this little village has an impressive history and many tales to tell. So on a rather gloriously sunny day, we set off for the Suffolk coast, looking forward to exploring this legendary place and getting a most welcome breath of sea air. As always seems to be the way for both Norfolk and Suffolk, we soon found we ran out of dual carriageway and kicked ourselves for not loading up on caffeine earlier in the drive, as we swiftly plunged into the narrow, winding roads of the Suffolk countryside, and the roadside service stations gave way to post office groceries and hardware stores selling tools, camping gas and logs. But the leafy lanes, picturesque houses, and first whiff of a salt breeze soon woke up our senses, and before we knew it, we were passing the ragged ruins of Dunwich's iconic Greyfriars Monastery, and at the bottom of the hill we found a spacious car park, settling in a spot with marshes stretching out on one side of us and the sea crashing on the other. Not that we could see the sea yet. From here we could only hear it, hidden as it was behind a large shingle bank protecting the car park from the ravages of the brutal North Sea waves. Despite being starving for our lunch, with a childlike glee the coast never fails to instill in me, I just couldn't wait any longer to see the sea, not even for sandwiches. And so I ran with car-stiff legs up the steep gravel bank, struggling against gravity and sliding downwards almost as fast as I moved up it, the shingle sliding away under my feet with every step. With legs burning, I pushed on comically slowly, eager to glimpse the coast, suck in a great lungful of salty air, and dip my toes in the lapping waves. Finally cresting the bank, that inhale of salt air was briskly whipped from my lungs with a wind stiffer than a Briton's upper lip, a wind that was lashing the not-so-lapping sea into a brownish-green fury of spume-tipped waves that crashed on the shingle, angrily sucking sand and gravel back into its hungry maw. The pleasant sunny day we had experienced on the drive here somehow didn't seem to penetrate beyond that tall shingle bank. Once on the loud shoreline with a nor'easterly whistling through my ears and murky waves trying to suck the blue right out of the sky and into the grey-green horizon, it was easy to feel the sense of foreboding that forms a focus for so many of Dunwich's ghostly myths and legends. And no wonder, for as I stand on this shoreline, the shingle shifting uneasily under my feet, looking out at an unending stretch of hostile sea, I am in fact looking at the ghost of Dunwich town. This beach, and indeed the car park where the coffee-mobile sits huddled beneath the sheltering wall of the defensive bank, was once a bustling harbour, alive and thriving with shipping, shipbuilding, and a lucrative fishing trade in herring and sprat. In its heyday, it was one of the 10 largest towns in England, had a population estimated between 3,000 and 5,000, and was even said to rival London's square mile. Where I'm standing was once the very outer reaches of the town, whilst ahead of me, under the yawning expanse of ocean, are the submerged parishes of St Leonard's, St Bartholomew's, and St Martin's, among others, all with their own churches, 10 of which now lie beneath the North Sea. Not to mention 2 friaries, a guildhall, a mint, a marketplace, and, of course, hundreds of houses, all consumed by the sea. Maybe it shouldn't be a surprise with so many ecclesiastical buildings lost to the waves, but the most well-known ghost story from Dunwich is that of the ghostly bells of its churches, said to ring out on stormy nights, warning of impending danger from the tide. Ghostly bells are quite a common story to find around the UK, especially where sunken villages are concerned. And with a number of churches tolling their bells across the country, one might be forgiven for wondering if witnesses are not mistaking the sound of very earthly church bells for ghostly ones. But quite aside from the fact that apparently it was quite common to find locals who had heard the bells themselves when a storm was incoming right up until the middle of the 20th century, they could reportedly identify the bells from any other surrounding churches because one note of the carillon was missing. But there are several other distinctive apparitions spotted on this shoreline by locals and visitors alike. A woman in Elizabethan attire has been seen walking down to the beach and drifting forlornly along the shore before inexplicably disappearing. Interestingly, other accounts describe the phantom of a sailor, smartly dressed in red and white uniform, roaming the beach as though searching for someone. Evidently not finding what or who he is searching for, he is said to then wade out to sea, or sometimes even to board a spectral ship, before both the craft and the sailor mysteriously vanish. This apparition too is reported to be wearing Elizabethan garb. I'm not entirely sure why, as the red and blue uniform that was implied as the reason for this didn't turn up anything obviously Elizabethan for me when I searched. But I wonder if maybe people are linking the lost-looking female apparition and the searching sailor together, and hoping that it is each other they're looking for, and that one day maybe they'll be reunited. But perhaps the most unusual apparitions of Dunwich, and maybe one of my favourites of all our paranormal postcards, is that of phantom sheep and cows, sedately grazing the now grassless shoreline, just as they would have done before the shifting sand and gravel of the constantly moving coast swallowed what was once the low-lying grazing land of Dunwich.
From the way that Dunwich is hailed as Britain's Atlantis, you could be forgiven for thinking that it mysteriously vanished in a night and a day, but in fact the town has been beset by the ravages of the sea since before written records began, and the waves have been biting off chunks of this settlement for at least 900 years. Although Paleolithic and Roman artefacts have been uncovered at Dunwich, the earliest confirmed settlement remains are that of Pale's Dyke, a massive ditch 10 metres wide and 3.7 metres deep, with a palisade-top bank behind, built to defend the boundary of the town. For many years, the evidence pointed to this being Norman in origin, but investigations by Wessex Archaeology in 2011 and by the University of Southampton in 2015 suggest a settlement may have been established much earlier, by Saxon or even Iron Age times, a theory very much in line with the widely held belief of historians and locals alike that Dunwich was already a thriving port and market town by the time of the Anglo-Saxons. The University of Southampton found even more evidence to this end in their 2015 investigations, and employed some pretty unusual and interesting techniques to collect it. Rather than digging trenches down into the lost roads and ditches of the ancient settlement, they abseiled over the cliff to take samples from where the remains of Pale's Dyke and 3 of Dunwich's older roads were exposed in the raw cliff face, after the land beyond them had crumbled onto the beach. The team found deposits in one of the roads that dated to the 7th century, and evidence of a retting pit being used from the 5th to the 11th century. Retting being a process of rope making, which would have been a vital industry for a busy port town. All of which speaks to Dunwich having been settled by Saxon times, and maybe as early as the Iron Age. Some historians have even suggested Dunwich was an Anglo-Saxon capital, certainly with the proximity to the famous Sutton Hoo burial and nearby Rendlesham's connection to the Woffinger Saxon royal dynasty. This theory seems pretty logical, and incidentally both of those places are on our list to visit. Dunwich was for many years believed to have been the location referenced in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as Dommuch or Dunmuch by Bede the Venerable, a monk, author and scholar writing around the year 735. Bede tells of how St Felix came to Suffolk to assist Sigebert, king of the East Angles, in spreading the word of Christianity. In return for his support of Sigebert, St Felix was made the first bishop of East Anglia, where he set about establishing a school. As Bede reports it, where boys could be taught letters, and was widely credited in the following years and centuries with converting the East Anglians to Christianity. These days the location of Dunmuch is much disputed, and many historians now think that the real location may have been further down the coast at Walton near Felixstowe. But the debate rages on. If Dunwich was an early seat of such religious importance, it would certainly help make sense of the high number of ecclesiastical buildings present in the Middle Ages, up to 18 in some counts, in the square mile that made up medieval Dunwich. There is also the fact that some arguments against Dunwich being the much-storied Dommuch rests on Bede's inference that the site was established on land with previous Roman occupation. The problem with this argument is that 90% of medieval Dunwich is under the sea, and has been for centuries. In fact, a massive amount of the old town had already been swallowed by the waves by the end of the 14th century. So can we ever really know if there was any evidence of a Roman settlement at Dunwich, when any such potential sites have been submerged for over 600 years? All this speculation just adds more threads to the web of mystery that weaves through the fabric of this town.
It's so difficult to gather consistent facts and dates and grasp a true context of this perplexing place when so much of its story happened before written records began. Even one of Dunwich's legends is thought to date way back to the 12th century, the legend of the Dark Heart of Dunwich. In a retelling of the tale by Suffolk residents as part of the Land and Shore Heritage and Creative Arts Project, a rather spooky shadow puppet film tells of Eva, a fair young maiden of the town who was betrothed to a wealthy farmer's son, not by her own wishes but by the business aspirations of her father, who sought to use his daughter as a bargaining chip in future trade connections. However, one day a handsome sailor swept into Dunwich harbour and swept Eva off her feet. In secret, shadowy corners, the pair held clandestine meetings, and the sailor whispered promises of love and marriage in Eva's eager ears as she dreamed of escaping the unwanted future set out before her by her father. But Eva was to be betrayed by another, a spiteful young woman, jealous of the attention Eva's beauty had brought her, who discovered the amorous couple in their secret meeting place and ran straight to Eva's father to spill the beans. Furious arguments ensued, and Eva fled to the harbour as quickly as she could to find her love and tell him that they must marry at once lest all would be lost. Alas, it already was. Eva's frantic heartbeat skipped as she spotted her suitor's ship, no longer anchored in the port, but a retreating speck on the horizon. Spirits sinking quickly into despair, she scoured the shore, but the man was gone, leaving her reputation in tatters and a heinous future laid out for the rest of her years. She could not, would not bear it. She would rather give her heart to the tempestuous sea than marry another, and give it she did. She reached into her chest and plucked out her heart, darkened as it was with grief and despair, and flung it into the water. No restful place for her heartsick soul. She committed her lifeblood to the roiling waves, to be fetched and flung on the tides for evermore. Locals say that every now and again a little heart, apparently formed from wave-smoothed driftwood, washes up on the beach. Unwitting tourists may think this a pretty little thing, may think to pick it up and take it home for the mantelpiece, a charming souvenir from a seaside town, but locals would warn you not to touch it, not to go anywhere near it, for this is Eva's dark, sorrowful heart, and nothing but misery will come to anyone who pulls the wretched thing from the sand.
I wish that there was some way we could travel back in time to the 12th century and hear this story with all its original nuance and context, told close by smoky fires on chilly winter nights. But for all that may have been lost along the centuries, one clear message has remained, a theme that seems to shine through so many of Dunwich's stories and legends, that the sea on this coastline is not a benevolent one. Fortunes live and die on it, loves are lost to it. The tide is tumultuous and capricious, and the stories from hereabouts seem to reflect the inconstant nature of the ever-shifting tides. Given the long list of storm losses Dunwich has suffered over the centuries, this is not surprising. The first records of these losses date from before the Domesday Book was completed, in which it was recorded that in the years since the Norman invasion, over half of the taxable farmland at Dunwich had been lost to the sea. But it was later storms that really turned the town's fortunes, notably one in 1328 that took 347 out of the 400 houses in the parishes of St Leonard's, St Martin's and St Bartholomew's, and one in 1347 that saw the loss of a further 400 to 600 houses. Although there had been many before this, the town had always sought to repair and rebuild, putting in place increasing defences to protect the harbour from silting up. But those storms of the mid-14th century changed the landscape irreparably. Not only was the harbour silted up, but the actual course of the river was rerouted further up the coast to Walberswick, completely destroying the estuary that had emptied out into a calm, protected harbour and had once brought Dunwich such fortune.
This calamity didn't spell the immediate end to Dunwich, although it certainly was the beginning of its downfall. But not everybody in the town gave up. The Franciscan monks were among those who stayed, and it's their legacy that has me slipping and sliding my way back up and over the rolling shelves of the shingle beach to slither back down the gravel slope to the car, noting as I did so that in a rather marvellous display of either wishful thinking or stubborn denial, 2 hardy souls were sunbathing on towels atop the wind-battered bank, sheltering in the lee of a small red boat that was beached on the gravel. Good for them, I say, but I wasn't prepared to risk even my sandwiches in these blustery conditions, let alone my flesh, so I retreated to the coffee-mobile for lunch and to plan my explorations. During my initial research, I had happily come across a very handy tourist trail of the town, titled Walking with Ghosts. Well, obviously, that had got my attention, and leaving the van now, I had the printed route clutched tightly in my hand. It detailed a circular walk starting at the car park and touring all the hot spots of historic and haunted Dunwich in a 1-mile circuit, which basically did a lot of the hard work for me in planning my explorations. Now, I love nothing better than setting out on a walk with a map, and so to have the coast at my side and haunted ruins on the itinerary, I was about as gleeful as a girl could be as I strode out of the car park, my head wrapped up in a buff and sunglasses against the wind-blown sand. The route took me up towards what seemed to be the main street of the village, although you could be forgiven for thinking at first glance that it was the only street of the village. Emerging onto Beach Road at a junction jauntily decorated with colourful bunting, I soon spotted a footpath sign, beckoning me into the hedgerow and towards my first destination. The path climbed through a leafy green tunnel along the line of the cliff, which forms part of the Suffolk Coast Path long-distance trail. Through the tree line and tall foliage of brambles and alexanders, I caught frequent glimpses of the steel-grey sea. But, almost as frequent, were the large signs warning danger, cliff may collapse without warning, stay at least 2 meters from the cliff edge. In some places, the drop-off looked so sheer, I wasn't sure I had as much as 2 meters to leave between me and the cliff edge. It was a sobering thought to realise that within my lifetime, the very path I was on right now would likely collapse onto the beach below. But I didn't have long to dwell on that thought, as rounding a corner I caught my first glimpse of Greyfriars Monastery peeping through a waving curtain of elder branches, and soon I was upon the boundary wall, a thick, rough flint affair, fringed with tall grasses that filled the expanse of the once imposing site. Greyfriars was one of 2 monastic buildings that stood in old Dunwich town back in the 13th century. One, a Franciscan friary, and the other, Blackfriars, a Dominican friary. But these buildings had been built on the lower-lying land of Dunwich, and both had succumbed to the waves, Greyfriars having been taken in a massive storm on New Year's Eve of 1286. In 1290, King Edward I granted the Franciscan friars 4.5 acres of land to rebuild their monastery, this time located just outside the town boundary, safe from the reach of the sea. For a few centuries anyway. The perimeter wall of the monastery on the east side, the side closest to the cliff edge, actually runs along the line of the old Palesdyke palisade, the ditch itself having been filled in when the friars started building here. So, the narrow footpath I was walking along was really the last remnant of the settlement originally enclosed by the ancient defensive ditch, just a few scarce feet left, poised to be claimed by the ocean at any time. The boundary wall dipped and undulated in height, ruined in some parts, rebuilt in others, but enough of it left standing to give a sense of how big the friary was in its heyday, the wall encompassing the whole expanse from the cliffside in the east to the road we drove in on the west, and stretching off towards the tree line of Greyfriars Woods in the south. Its size made to feel all the bigger by the fact that of all this rather spacious precinct, only the tattered stonework of one block remained standing. Approaching the gap in the wall into the friary precinct, the entryway perfectly frames the remaining ruins, a jumble of crumbling walls and archways that used to be the refectory, and directly behind them, at the far west of the site, the two great medieval gateways that were once the main and pedestrian entrances for visitors from outside Dunwich. This viewpoint captures everything left standing in one neat, picturesque snapshot, but it also serves to make the last fragments of the friary seem rather lost and lonely, adrift as they are in the vast, waving green sea of long grass. An information board helps to fill in the missing buildings. The one block whose remains form the famous ruins that are seen today originally formed one corner of a quadrangle, made up of the friary church, a chapter house, the warden's house, and guest accommodation, in addition to the refectory and kitchen, all set around a central courtyard with covered walkways known as cloisters. When I arrive, a handful of people are quietly milling about in the remains of the refectory, but as I make my way into the precinct, as if by magic, they pick up and leave. I'm not sure if that says anything about me or not, but either way, I was secretly thrilled to have the place all to myself. The two-storey north wall of the refectory is the largest piece of masonry still standing, and gives an impression of what the place might have looked like when grey-robed monks still swept solemnly along its passageways. A partial internal wall still stands behind the north face, and the great arched windows punctuating the ground and upper floors almost make you feel as though you could peer in through a window and spot the streak of a pale robe passing by out the corner of your eye. Standing in this almost corridor, open at both ends and to the sky, it was possible to get a feeling for the place, a sense of its energy almost, or maybe of its long years. I decided to perch in one of the arched windows and sit quietly for a while, to see if I felt anything else, or if maybe a flash of a grey robe would catch my eye, or a snatch of chanting would reach my ears on the breeze.
Witnesses have reported seeing the drifting shapes of robed monks moving about the precinct at night. The unexplained sounds of chanting have been heard emanating from the ruins. And no wonder, because quite aside from how big a part of their lives this building would have been to the Friars of Dunwich, it turns out that some of them may have never left. In the late 1990s, Suffolk archaeology dug several trenches on the site and uncovered a substantial and largely intact monastic cemetery in the area around where the friary church had stood. 94 graves were confirmed and documented, but the report states that there were hundreds more graves that were simply out of the scope of the survey to investigate. Their estimation stood at a minimum of 260 graves in the church area, but further graves to the north, south and west could reasonably number up to 1,000. Of these, only 3 were fully excavated, although the reports noted other graves being partially excavated and some disturbed by trench digging equipment. 2 of the excavated graves were men, one a young or middle-aged male, and one an elderly man. Could either of these burials have been medieval friars? And might disturbing their graves have stirred up any slumbering spirits? However, it's not just ghostly monks that have been spotted here. Locals say that in the darkest part of the year, between October and Christmas Eve, will-o'-the-wisps can be seen glowing eerily amidst the ruins. Also known as hobby lanterns, these unexplained ghostly lights are much feared in local traditions all over the country. They often appear to travellers lost in the dark, who follow them hoping the light will lead them to safety, only to find themselves tricked and led to an untimely end. They are often associated with treacherous marshland of the old fens of East Anglia, and a modern explanation for at least some of them is that rotting plants of the marshes exude a gas which can spontaneously combust, causing the incandescent lights. But up here on a windy clifftop, there is no marsh gas to explain away such a phenomenon. So what are the mysterious lights seen in the ruins after dark? Could it be the echo of the monks' lanterns as they rose at midnight for matters? And of course, it wouldn't be an East Coast visit without mention of dear old Shuck. In the 1920s, a young girl named Ethel was visiting Dunwich on holiday and was exploring the Greyfriars site with her mother. A creeping feeling of being watched came over her, and when she looked up, a large black dog, mouth hanging open, was staring fiercely at her from the ruins. Frightened, she ran off and told the local fisherman what she had seen. The man tried to calm her and said it must only have been a sheepdog from hereabouts. But when the fisherman described the sheepdog, Ethel shook her head. No, it was nothing like that at all. At which it said that the fisherman took off running in fright, now convinced that the girl had indeed encountered the fearsome black Shuck.
From my extremely draughty seat in the window, however, I sadly did not catch any glimpse of ghostly monks, and was rather relieved not to have encountered Shuck, truth be told. The place definitely had an atmosphere, but to me it felt very calm and peaceful, and not spooky at all. Although, later on, after our visit, when I was watching a paranormal investigation video of Greyfriars by Chris Holton of Haunted Earth TV, Chris reported that he felt a definite energy in the ruins that seemed to be coming from a particular spot. He then proceeded to point to the exact spot where I had chosen to sit and soak up the atmosphere. So make of that what you will. But even more interestingly, later on in the video, he captures something on the video's audio. He doesn't hear it at the time, although he does mention on a couple of occasions that he thinks he hears a voice. Listening back to it, however, there is definitely a voice, and it's not his. To me, it sounds exactly like a low male voice singing or chanting. I can hear specific notes to the voice and was able to sing back the tune after listening. It's a very interesting capture. The investigator was alone, and having watched some of his previous videos, that does seem to be his standard way of working. And having been to the site, I know that at night there is really nothing else around where a voice that close could be coming from. The site is expansive, bordered by woods on all sides and a sheer drop down the cliff face on one. The nearest houses are too far away for that kind of noise contamination, and if anyone else was walking around the place at night, I really think they would struggle to keep from being heard and seen in such a vast open space. There's nowhere to hide nearby enough for that voice to have been picked up. A little later in the video, another couple of syllables are caught on audio, and to my ear it sounds like the exact same voice, male and with a musical quality to it. I can't help but be thrilled. This feels like the confirmation of the long-held tradition that the unexplained phantom sounds of chanting can be heard amongst the ruins. I was honestly sad to have to pull myself away from the tranquility of the old friary. Even now, in its ruined state, it still had an air of reflection and sanctuary.
After the last friar had left, and the buildings had been partially demolished, Greyfriars did go on to have another life. A life which was evident in the telltale hodgepodge of the masonry. Originally, it would have been built principally in flint, but the north face is a puzzle of not only Suffolk flint, but also thick chunks of limestone and red brick. After the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, demolition began, and a lot of building material was reclaimed from the site. But early in the 1700s, Greyfriars was given a reprieve when it was purchased by Sir George Downing. Downing built a country house right around the ruins, incorporating the shell of the friary into his 3-story high building with crenellated brick facade. He named his house The Place, but apparently the locals took to calling it Dunwich Castle, a title maybe more appropriate in later years when the structure served variously as a town hall and a jail. For a while, Greyfriars was once more a central part of Dunwich life, but it didn't last for long, because the next owners, the Barn family, purchasing at the very beginning of the 19th century, tore down all of Downing's additions and alterations, restoring the friary to the original ruins. The Barn family preferred to keep the site a picturesque romantic ruin, and we'll hear more about the family later, but for now, we have to go and find a grave. The last grave, in fact. Just outside the friary precinct, on the narrow cliff-top footpath, a sturdy wooden barrier on the east side deters any foolhardy souls from wandering too close to the dangerous cliff edge. But partway along, a little turn-off veers sharply towards the sea, edging rather close to where all those signs warn you not to venture. It's a short diversion, ending in yet more wooden barrier, but just beyond this lies a single weathered grey gravestone with the following inscription. In memory of Jacob Forster, who departed this life March 12, 1796, aged 38 years. Immediately behind it, through undergrowth that waves and shakes in the breeze, the steel grey of the sea flashes between the leaves, revealing the sheer drop beyond the gravestone and making it all too clear why this is known as the last grave. On the land to the east of Greyfriars, in the direction of the North Sea, a church once stood. All Saints' Church was actually one of the longest standing pieces of old Dunwich, and one of the best documented. It did eventually succumb to coastal erosion, as so much of the town did, but it managed to hang on until early in the 20th century, meaning that photographs exist of its slow but inexorable destruction. A very poignant photo collage can be found online that shows the church at different stages of plunging down the cliff face. In the first, dated 1903, the abandoned church is still a few feet away from the rapidly degrading cliff edge. By 1905, we can see that a large chunk of wall has vanished, as though the Chewits Muncher monster has come along and taken a great bite out of it. The picture from 1912 shows just the tower and a scrap of arcaded wall still hanging on, and by 1920, there is just one lonely buttress balanced precariously on the cliff edge. Of course, this Norman church had, as most churches do, a graveyard, and this solitary weathered gravestone, sandwiched between the stubborn plant sprouting from the cliff edge and the sturdy wooden barrier, is all that remains of that graveyard. It's rather uncomfortable to think about, but of course the erosion of the cliff meant that all who were buried here went tumbling down the cliff just like the church, and for many years walkers on the beach down below could look up and see human bones sticking out of the cliff face, awaiting their final drop into the sea. A phenomena which was apparently very much in evidence even in recent years, according to a blog written in 2016. The tour map wisely warns visitors against picking up any graveyard objects they may find crumbling out of the cliff, lest they fall victim to a haunting, as did the character in M.R. James' short story, "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You," which the guide states came about when he took an object from All Saints' graveyard. We were fascinated as we hadn't heard that the story was inspired by Dunwich, but when we later watched the BBC omnibus adaptation of the tale, a black and white film directed by Jonathan Miller, the landscape depicted certainly did start to look familiar. A version of its original airing is still floating around on the internet today. On the recording, the contemporary announcer describes the tale as having a peculiar atmosphere of cranky scholarship, and the strange-sounding tagline is oddly accurate. To modern eyes, the film feels uncomfortably awkward, although maybe that was by design, to instill in the viewer an uncanny sense of mounting unease. But for hardcore M.R. James fans, the adaptation veers off course somewhat from the original. For one thing, the main character is depicted as a decidedly older, more peculiar and mumbly academic than James wrote of. Whereas James described the Cambridge University professor in his story as young, neat and precise in speech, the Professor Parkins in the 1968 film is an older gentleman by far, and mumbles his way around the rather bleak Suffolk boarding house in which he is holidaying, mumbles his way curiously and almost unintelligibly through his interactions with the other guests, and mumbles copiously to himself as he takes his self-described trudges along the beach. In the 1904 short story, Parkins is tasked by one of his Cambridge colleagues to look in on the site of an old Knights Templar preceptory and assess whether it might be a good dig site, which gives the reader some context as to why the academic might unearth an ancient cylindrical whistle from the site and take it away with him. By contrast, Miller's version sees Parkins happen seemingly by accident upon a clifftop cemetery, consisting of one lonely grave perched on the cliff edge. As the camera cuts to an angle shooting up from behind at the gravestone, we realise that behind the grave is a sheer drop down the cliff face, which leaves the end of the burial plot exposed. Sounding familiar yet? On his hands and knees, the professor then rather horrifyingly leans right out over the cliff and scrabbles around in the open ground, mumbling, "Give the dog a bone," and "Finders keepers," as he plucks a small metal whistle from the earth, dusts it off and pops it in his pocket. In both versions, the young and old professors universally ignore the ominous warning inscribed on the whistle in Latin, "Quis es ist qui venit," Who is this who is coming? And blow the whistle. And of course, both are haunted mercilessly as a result.
Watching the film before I read the short story, yes, I know, sacrilege, I had assumed that James had intended the story to be set at Dunwich. The movie representation seemed so clearly to represent All Saints' graveyard at the cliff edge. But despite the tourist map's claim, I couldn't find any reference that confirmed Dunwich was amongst the author's inspirations for this tale. Everything I could find pointed to the seaside town being a fictionalised version of the real-life Felixstowe, and the adaptation filmed in Waxham, Norfolk. But I wasn't convinced there wasn't some Dunwich inspiration in there, especially when I did a bit more hunting and discovered that there was, in fact, a ruined Knights Templar preceptory at Dunwich. According to historian Vincent Burrow Redstone, it was only 55 rods, which in modern measurement is less than 300 metres, from the Church of All Saints. He writes of it, "The temple at Dunwich, the site of which is now a hidden mound rising within the enclosed ground of Captain Miles' barn, was the most important of the houses of the Knights Templars in Suffolk." Comparing that to the description in James's story, which details a shingle beach, the Templar site being covered with depressions and mounds, and this following nugget from Parkin's colleague when he was asking him to check out the preceptory. The site must be close to the beach now. The sea has encroached tremendously, as you know, all along that bit of coast. Having looked up Captain Miles' barn mentioned in Vincent Burrow Redstone's record of the Dunwich preceptory, the captain owned the land around and including Greyfriars until he died in 1917, meaning that if the historian was correct, the Templar ruins could still have been around in 1904 when the short story was first published. Or at least, that's what I thought, until in the last throes of my research, I discovered two separate accounts stating that the Templar preceptory ruins had been washed away in the 17th century. So what on earth was Vincent Burrow Redstone talking about when he so confidently talked about the ruins being on the land of a man who lived in the 20th century? Well, that was a conundrum I could not solve. Although I did find records of an archaeologist in the 1930s excavating a mound on the Barn estate, close to Greyfriars and All Saints Church, known locally as Temple Hill. This set some bells ringing in my head, and although I couldn't find much else out about this site, I did find that old Templar sites across the country commonly retain the word temple in their local names, which makes me think that Temple Hill must at least have been thought at one time to be linked to the Knights Templar. So what's the truth? I'm not sure we'll ever know. I'd love to hear from any M.R. James buffs out there if Dunwich is known as an inspiration for a whistle, and I'll come to you. And I'd love to know if the Temple Hill mound, whether it be the old preceptory or something else entirely, might have been another of the town's haunted locations before it dropped figuratively and literally off the map. But for now, it's just another piece to the mysterious puzzle that is Dunwich. And of course, a reminder to us all to never take things from historic ruins. As I leave the friary and the last grave behind me, I walk south, with the cliff edge on my left towards a tree line. The map instructs me to go through a wooden gate and enter Greyfriars Woods. Walk through the woods until you reach a sunken path. And here, I was told, I would find more ghosts. The sunken path is actually the remains of Middlegate Street, a medieval road that was once one of the main thoroughfares into Dunwich town. Hundreds of years ago, goods-laden carts would have trundled along here pulled by road-weary horses. But now only my own footsteps break through the rustling of the tree canopy and the sound of the waves crashing and rushing on the beach below, as I descend a few feet down to the level of the road, highlighting just how much the ground level has changed over the course of centuries. After a while, I came upon a quaint little bridge, so short that I have to duck under it to pass below, despite my fairly mediocre 5'7" height. Fascinated, I can't help but climb up the bank for a better look at it, and, having clambered up to where the bridge passes over Middlegate Street, I can see it's very narrow, which makes me wonder at its purpose. As it turns out, this strange little feature was installed by the Barn family, who, you may have noticed, have cropped up a couple of times already on this visit.
Back in the days when the landed gentry owned entire villages, were landlords to most of the locals, and built sprawling country piles that employed many of the villagers as staff, Dunwich was no exception to the rule. You might think that with all the storm damage, the loss of the important harbour, and the rapidly diminishing coastline, that wealthy people might not want to invest in a shrinking village. But in actual fact, Dunwich was a bit of a prize for anybody who wanted to have influence or a position in the government. In 1268, Dunwich was such a large and important town that it was invited by Parliament to represent its constituents at what would eventually become the House of Commons. In its heyday, the large population of Dunwich entitled voters to elect 2 MPs to represent them at Parliament, and due to the peculiarities of English law, this was a right they retained all the way up to the 19th century. In later years, this became problematic. We already know how much of Dunwich was lost over the centuries, and therefore how much the population dwindled. Electing 2 MPs makes sense if there are many residents in a town and multiple candidates to choose from. But in a town where the population had dwindled, as it had in Dunwich by the mid-19th century, to 237, electing 2 MPs from a choice of 2 landowners with such a small voting corps was a bit of a shoo-in. Dunwich wasn't the only town in which this became a problem due to vastly changing populations, and they became known as rotten boroughs. The most notorious of all was Old Sarum in Wiltshire, which at the 1801 census had just 3 houses, 7 voters, and yet could elect 3 MPs. Whereas towns in which the population had exploded over the years, like Manchester with over 70,000 voters and Birmingham with over 80,000, had no representation at all. Eventually this was all addressed in the Parliamentary Boundaries Act of 1832, but in the intervening years, the phenomena made Dunwich a valuable little place to own land in, and from the early 1800s right up until 1947, the owners of most of the land in Dunwich, including the ruins of Greyfriars, the woods, and the heathland beyond, were the Barn family. It's quite common to find that local legends grow up over the years centred around the landed gentry of a town, and no surprise really, as the antics of these lords and ladies probably would have formed most of the local interest and gossip for those subservient to and employed by them. Local landlords who were disliked often emerged as mythical villains to whom all sorts of nefarious deeds were attributed. But it seems the Barn family were regarded as quite benevolent and progressive landlords. That didn't stop them becoming the focus of a few local legends, but far from making villains of them, the tales were more of the spooky variety. In This Haunted Isle, prolific paranormal author Peter Underwood writes about one member of the Barn family who was a renowned horseman and bred fine Arab horses. The Victorian squire was a familiar sight in the woodland around Greyfriars and out on Dunwich Heath, and no fair weather horseman either, venturing out in his distinctive tall white hat come sun, wind or rain. According to locals, he loved his horses so much that for years after he'd passed away, he could still be spotted in his tall white hat, out on the heath or in Greyfriars Woods, sweeping through the shadowy tree line on nights when the moon was full or on the wane. Even soldiers billeted around Dunwich during the First World War were reported to have seen the apparition, noting how distinctive his fine Arab thoroughbred was from their own troop horses. And the Victorian squire wasn't the only member of the Barn family said to still be seen roaming about the darkened woodland at night. In her book Ghosts of Suffolk, Betty Puttick also tells the tale of the ghostly rider, but adds that the brother of the phantom Victorian squire haunts the woods as well. According to local law, the brother fell in love with one of the servant girls who worked at the manor house that the Barn family built near Greyfriars. Of course, the continuation of the romance was absolutely out of the question as far as the young man's family were concerned, and they swiftly made it clear that the couple must forget any hopes they had of a future together. But the brother couldn't overcome the loss of his one true love, and was said to have died of a broken heart. His spirit doomed to forever wander the places where they had spent such happy times together. His grief-stricken shade witnessed flitting between the trees in Greyfriars Woods and wandering forlornly along the beach, his footfalls leaving no trace in the sand.
But what of the curious little bridge? And why did the Barn family plonk a bridge in the middle of the woods over a sunken path that can be climbed in a mere 3 strides anyway? Well, apparently it was so that little pony carts could carry tea trolleys from the manor house through the woods over to the site of the old friary so the family could have picnics in the ruins. I even found one account that said this bridge was only one of 3 or 4, and one of them had a miniature railway over it, although these have long since been lost to the eroding landscape. I don't know about you, but I'd pay good money to take a pony trap over a quaint little bridge through some haunted woods and be brought a picnic on a tea trolley in the ruins of a haunted friary. Good money, I tell you. As I emerge out of the woods, blinking in the bright sunshine after the shade of the tree canopy, I really want to ditch the map and go rogue, because I know that beyond the woods there are miles of heathland to explore. Dunwich Heath is now a nature reserve, and the heather and gorse that grows there provides an important habitat for a diverse species of ground-nesting birds and rare lizards. But during World War II, it played a crucial role in military operations, when one of the most significant exercises in preparation for the D-Day landings took place on the heathland. An operation involving a complete mock-up of trenches, barbed wire defences, pillboxes, weapon pits and anti-tank measures in 1943 called Operation Crucian. In my now rather sweaty little hand I have another map clutched. The Dunwich Wartime Trail, marking a route around the military scars in the landscape that tell the story of wartime Dunwich, and I wonder how many more secrets and stories this landscape holds. But I check the time, and I check the distance of the trail, and I sadly realise that this part of Dunwich's past will have to wait for another visit, as my time here is running out, and I have another haunted location to visit before we leave. I turn off and make my way down the hill we drove in on, passing the imposing medieval gates of the friary on my right as I begin to close the loop of my circular tour. The map leads back towards the main road of the village and the sea. As I'm directed down a leafy alley, I have a confused moment, getting slightly lost between some wheelie bins and a shed. I grow a little concerned that the map has erroneously led me into somebody's garden, and I gingerly creep my way through, expecting to be yelled at any moment. But it turns out that the unlikely-looking route was indeed the correct way, and I pop out into a courtyard bright with tall pink and red hollyhocks, and emerge onto the road in front of the tiny museum, with its cheerful-looking blue front door and a huge, ancient-looking anchor from Dunwich's port town days resting at a rakish angle in the front garden. Apparently, this little museum is a hidden gem and houses a scale model of Dunwich as it would have looked like in its heyday amongst other treasures. But with time pressing on and lacking the willingness to face mixing with other people in an enclosed space, I reluctantly pass it up and head to the last stop of the tour, a medieval leprosy hospital. A little further down the road, I find the Church of St. James. Enter through the small wooden gate and stand in the churchyard under the dappled shade of mature trees. In front and to the right of me is the solid-looking grey St. James Church. Quite a modern building really as far as today's tour goes, having been built in the comparatively recent 1837 and given a significant makeover in 1881. But it's what's tucked just behind it that brings me here today, and so I wind my way through the gravestones towards the ruins of a Norman chapel.
These days, leprosy is a curable disease, and more accurately known as Hansen's disease. But through the centuries past, it's sadly been a much misunderstood and highly stigmatized illness. It's been called the most ancient disease in the world, and historians have pinpointed potential references to it in ancient writings since records began. But the truth is, the descriptions in these writings, often translated from obscure or dead languages, could be easily confused for a multitude of other disorders that cause similar symptoms, and we have no way of knowing how many of these accounts truly identify leprosy from written sources alone. The history books are often quoted as saying that the 12th century Crusaders brought leprosy back to England with them from the countries where the disease was endemic. But archaeologists have identified the distinctive effects of advanced leprosy in skeletal remains unearthed in England from burials dating back to the 4th century. There undoubtedly was an uptick in cases during the 12th century though, and with increased international travel, busy port towns like Dunwich saw cases rising, leading to a law being passed in 1175 stating that people suffering from leprosy must live and be cared for on the outskirts of towns. Religious houses started to found hospitals to care for the affected across the country, and in the reign of King Richard I, the St. James Hospital and Chapel was founded at Dunwich just outside the town boundary to the west of the town. Of course, the fact that it was built on the outskirts of town, at Dunwich's westernmost limits, is the reason the ruins survive to this day, and it has, so far at least, escaped the storms and coastal erosion that took all the other Norman buildings. Because it wasn't founded by a monastic order, it also managed to survive the dissolution of the monasteries that wreaked such destruction during the 16th century. And so the hospital limped on right until the 1800s. Although by that time it had diversified to care for any sick, elderly or poor residents, and was in a state of disrepair, having been beset for many years by crooked masters who embezzled funds and sold off assets of the charitable hospital. This then is truly the oldest part of Dunwich still standing, and the only fragment left of the bustling 12th century port town. It would have once been a 60-foot long open hall, with beds for patients down either side, possibly separated by screens or cubicles. and at the end was the chapel, positioned so that the patients could see the altar from their beds and make their prayers even if they were too ill to rise. All that's left now is the ruins of the chapel, where the chancel and altar would have been. Thick, crumbling Norman walls, patched in many places with random rubble from centuries' worth of repairs and refacings, but the creamy yellow Normandy carved stone from the 12th century architects showing through in the interlaced arches of the blank arcaded semicircular apse.
Given its sad history, I'm actually surprised that there are not more ghost stories or legends tied to this place. There are reports of odd shadows drifting amongst the ruins at night, and of course it's also said to be a favourite haunt of old Shuck. But then I would expect nothing less of the oldest building in Dunwich. Mostly though, people seem to experience an air of melancholy, and I have to agree with them. Even though the metal gate to the chapel is freely open for visitors, I hesitate slightly to go in, feeling a little like I might be disrupting the peace of the place. I do eventually enter, but don't stay long. The atmosphere isn't heavy or oppressive or spooky, but there is an air of gentle sadness, almost like a place finally sleeping after many long, weary years and dreaming uneasily of sad memories. It's impossible to forget what the patients here would have gone through, not only physically, but also due to the stigma of the disease, something which still hasn't really been overcome to this day, despite such incredible advances in the treatment available for it. I'm almost glad there aren't too many ghost sightings here. Hopefully that means that these poor souls are at rest. At the other end of the graveyard is one more object mentioned on my map. Nothing haunted, but a piece of old Dunwich nonetheless. I hunt around for a bit, and suddenly, there it is. I had unobservantly walked past it once, mistaking it for a memorial obelisk. But as I crane my neck to look up and still further up, I realise that this is the very last corner of All Saints' Church, a tall stone buttress rescued in the 1900s from its precarious perch up on the cliff edge near Greyfriars, just before it fell onto the beach below, and planted here in St James' Churchyard, a towering reminder of the iconic building that was lost to the sea. And all that remains for me now is to wend my way back to the car. I worried slightly about getting lost as the directions of my map had run out. But I needn't have worried. There aren't many streets to get lost in. And in fact, it was a straight walk down the road to the car park, passing by the museum once again on my way. And the part 19th century, part 18th century, red brick pub, the Ship Inn. Which, of course, as any old pub should do, has its own ghost story.
The inn was originally called the Barn Arms Hotel. Yep, it's the Barn family again. They just won't stop popping up, will they? But it was renamed in the 1960s when new owners took over the business. And it was this family who found they had an unexpected guest at their inn, of the spectral variety. The son of the Ship Inn's owners between 1960 and 1975 shared his memories of living there on the Francis Frith Historical Photography Archive website in 2007. He tells of the attic room he and his brother slept in, and how one night, after he'd left home to join the army, his brother had awoken in the night and looked up to be surprised by the sight of a woman, greyish in pallor, sitting beside his bed. Even while he was still coming to from his slumber, and before he had a chance to react, the mysterious woman rose from his bedside, turned and walked straight through the wall. It doesn't seem as though this was a well-known apparition, as apparently no one believed his brother's story, much to his chagrin, I'm sure. However, in the late 90s, the son revisited his childhood home and site of his brother's experience. The owners at the time of the visit had been friends of the family, and so for nostalgia's sake, they gave him a tour of the old place. Well, imagine his surprise when they reached the attic room, and he noticed there was now a doorway in the attic wall leading to an entire room that, as far as he could remember, had never been there before. The new landlady explained that at some point it had come to their attention that there was an extra window next to the attic dormer, which of course didn't make sense. And so, with their interest well and truly piqued, they investigated, digging behind the plaster of the attic room, and found, to their great surprise, a complete functional boarded-up room that nobody had known existed. I wonder how vindicated his brother felt when they discovered that the apparition he'd seen all those years ago had vanished through the exact spot in the wall that concealed a secret hidden doorway.
I arrive back at the car park and we rush to pack before it closes. We're already one of the last cars here. But I have to have one more lingering look at the sea before we leave, and so I tear up and over the shingle bank, cursing my burning calves, and for one final time gaze into the depths of that angry, steel-grey North Sea. I try to visualise the thriving city that once stretched out across this landscape, to replace all the missing churches and monasteries and houses in my mind's eye. But in a very real way, much of the town isn't actually missing at all. For many years, people thought that the town had been swept away by the sea in a literal sense, the water breaking up the buildings and scattering them far and wide across endless miles of ocean. But from the 1970s, marine archaeologists and divers have been searching below the waves for the so-called lost city, and what they found tells a rather different story. It took many years to get results, largely because the North Sea is not only hostile, it's also extremely murky. Suspended sediment, sand and mud from river outflow and material dredged up on the ebb tide mean that visibility underwater is practically zero. But on one uncharacteristically calm and clear day, marine archaeologist Stuart Bacon, who had a lifelong interest in Dunwich's story, managed to chance upon a rare 1 metre of visibility and spotted the ruins of All Saints' Church, crawling with crabs and covered with bright pink sponges. On another dive, he took a chance on information from a Tudor map, working out how far from the beach another of Dunwich's many churches would have stood before the coastline changed, and measuring out that exact length in a coil of rope. He recalls how, just before the rope went taut, he was gifted another rare window of clear visibility, and right there were the remains of St. Peter's Church, exactly where they were meant to be. In Betty Puttick's book, Ghosts of Suffolk, she states that some divers had reported the unsettling feeling of being watched whilst searching about the site of the sunken town. For his part, Stuart Bacon remarked, "There's something about Dunwich that gives you this awesome feeling. It's quite a deep feeling. Once you're down there in the dark, and certainly when you're on a ruin, your mind goes a bit wild." In more recent years, sonar and digital mapping have added to the divers' explorations, and extensive areas of the lost town have been mapped out on the seabed right where the local law said they would be. And so perhaps the lost city of Dunwich isn't so lost after all. The ghostly sheep and cattle that graze their phantom pastures along the shore certainly don't think so. And perhaps neither do some of the old townsfolk. Maybe one of the most poignant ghost stories from Dunwich is another from Betty Puttick's collection, and it shares the recollections of a couple who hitchhiked into Dunwich in the 1970s. Having enjoyed the hostelry of the local pub for a while, they made the most of the balmy summer evening with a stroll along the beach, enjoying it so much that they decided to unfurl their sleeping bags and sleep right there on the beach. However, in the darkness of the small hours, their peace was disturbed when they were awoken by the very unexpected sound of a group of children, chattering, laughing together, the unmistakable sound of young children playing. Casting about the dark beach, they could see just enough to make out the objects and landscapes around them, but there were no children to be seen. And why on earth would there be? What group of youngsters would be out unaccompanied in the middle of the night? The beach was visibly empty even as the sounds continued, but the couple were eventually overcome by sleep and found nothing come first light to explain away the experience. They were convinced that what they had heard was the sounds of the children of Dunwich from many centuries ago, unaware that their town had changed at all, still happily playing, maybe in a street or a field they once knew, their cheerful voices echoing down the centuries, the Dunwich that once was, still lingering, just out of reach. As I ran back to the coffee-mobile to head for home, with a pocket full of beach pebbles and a head full of ghost stories whispered on the waves, I have to agree with Stuart Bacon. There is something a bit special about Dunwich. Something awesome, something deep, and something that can make your mind go a bit wild.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Not Once for Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, and please do get in touch if you have had a paranormal experience that you would like to share at notonceforyes.com. A huge thank you to our patrons, coffee and Repod supporters, without whom we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And Not Once for Yes is produced by my production company Narrative Audio, and if you have a podcast and would like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Not Once for Yes or narrativeaudio.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and that you'll join us again for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Not Once for Yes.